Welcome everyone to Electric Vehicle Programs, How to Strike a Balance Between Excitement and Execution. We'll get started shortly here. Welcome everyone to Electric Vehicle Programs, How to Strike a Balance Between Excitement and Execution. We'll be starting shortly. Welcome everybody to Electric Vehicle Programs, How to Strike a Balance Between Excitement and Execution. We'll be starting here in just a minute or two. Thank you. Okay, and welcome everyone again to Electric Vehicle Programs, How to Strike a Balance Between Excitement and Execution. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to let everybody know, this webinar is being recorded, and following the webinar, we'll send out this recording and slide deck to everybody who registered. If you have a question for our panel during the presentation, please submit it in the Q&A. Our moderator today is Peter Westlake. He is the manager of new products and services at the Orlando Utilities Commission. Pete is also a current member of SEIA's board of directors and serves on our energy efficient transportation and membership committees. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone who's joining this subject. This one is near and dear to my heart, so I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say about this. But first, let me tell you a little bit about SEIA. We were founded in 2007. SEIA works to ensure decision makers have knowledge, resources, and opportunities to use energy more efficiently. We advance equitable energy policy, support strong building energy codes, and work to expand access to energy efficient transportation options. Our goal is to optimize the use and impact of energy so that all people in the Southeast can live and work in healthy and resilient buildings, utilize clean and affordable transportation, and thrive in a robust and equitable economy. And quite frankly, SEIA is a great integrator and convener of brain trusts across the Southeast to solve very complicated problems. So why is this webinar relevant in this moment in time? Well, in response to anticipated federal funding and consumer demand, more states, municipalities, and utilities are embarking on EV programs. I know at OUC, we're all in on electric vehicles. How do we evaluate the benefits and costs of new technology and find the right balance for regulators? Well, today's panel of experts will give us those insights on selecting methodology and implementation with case studies from both Maryland and North Carolina regulators. Let me introduce the speakers first, and then I'll jump back in and talk to you a little bit about some framing. First, we have Chris Neame, is the principal of clean energy consulting firm, Energy Futures Group. Chris has helped clients across the US, Canada, and Europe with a variety of energy efficiency, demand response, strategic electrification, and other distributed energy resource market assessments, programs, and policies. Chris co-authored the 2020 National Standards Practice Manual for the benefit cost analysis of distributed energy resources. The manual we'll be referencing today in this webinar, which makes him a great resource for us today. Amanda Best is a senior commission advisor to Maryland Public Service Commission. She's the work group leader for the electric vehicle work group under Public Conference 44, which is Maryland's grid modernization initiative. And she'll be talking more about the process. Evan Lawrence is the public utilities engineer with the North Carolina Utility Commission, where he works on rate design, audits of utility capital projects, and review of CPCN applications for solar generating facilities. Review and implementation of North Carolina REPS plan and reports, and the review of electric transportation pilot proposal by Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. So a wealth of experience there. But I'd like to talk, and I'd like to tee this up a little bit. So how do municipalities, utilities approach program analysis for EVs? So could you move it to the next slide for us? And the next one after that, please. So at OUC, we look at things holistically for the electric vehicle market, the electric vehicles that show up in our service territory. Each residential vehicle represents approximately $350 in increased energy sales per year. That means the 8,000 vehicles in our service territory represent 2.8 million. And our goal of driving the adoption to 40,000 by 2025 will increase that to 14 million annually. This is a big deal, both from grid planning, as you'll see in a few seconds, to increase revenue. Just to look at our programs, we break them out into 5 categories: policy, education, adoption rates, and infrastructure. And you can see there's a number of projects behind them. But just to highlight a few, we've actually we've made a commitment for $45 million to promote electrification of our service territory over the next 10 years. And that's up to 8 high-speed charging hubs, an education center, electric bus infrastructure, airport, commercial fleets, and residential transportation. Can you move to the next slide for me, please? And you can see we actually go out and get DMV data once a quarter to take a look at the statistics across Florida. And here's what we're seeing. Since 2016 through until about now, we've had a pretty lazy increase, about 25% to a top end about 35% per year. And this year in 2021, we are seeing an inflection. So this year we plan to see about a 70% growth over last year's electric vehicles, which puts us in line with that 40,000 vehicles by 2025. Can you move to the next slide for me? So this is my view. We're at the bottom of the S curve, and here's why I think it is. Trucks are coming. They're going to be here at any time. And that opens up a whole new vehicle market. The semis are also coming, and we're going to see Tesla semis and other brands of semis on the roadways this coming year. Buses are already electrifying, but we're going to see a mass adoption in our service territory. Within the next 5 years, we expect to see 150 buses in our area. And we've had preliminary conversations with the Amazons and the PepsiCos and so forth for the last mile delivery. And we will see those change en masse within the next couple of years. And lastly, the promise of the $25,000 car for a long range car. I think all of these things add up to we're at the bottom of the S curve, and we're going to see it really expand. Can you advance, please? So here's why it's a big deal to the utilities. In 2016, we've got the standard duck curve that all utilities enjoy. When you get to 2025, when we talk about 40 or 50,000 vehicles, you can see we're starting to fill in the valley, which is not a bad thing. And you've got a $14 million revenue increase. When you get to 2028, just 3 short years later, and if you have the same adoption rate, you're at 100,000 vehicles, and now you're seeing that valley fully consumed. But you've got $28 million of additional revenue. But 2030 is when things start to get squirrely, because what you've got there is you're actually setting new load peaks for the whole service territory. So if you could move to the next slide. So in OUC, we plan to put charging hubs across our service territory to help promote growth. And you can go to the next slide. We also have dealership programs we put in place, recognizing that it costs a lot more time for a sales representative to sell vehicles. We actually incentivize them for every vehicle that they sell that's electric. We also put a $50 rebate out for our customers who take a test drive. And we've got a 30% conversion rate of those people who take those test drives. Can you move to the next? We think education is going to be key. So we've got on the plan to do an education center similar to these. Can you move to the next? And just last considerations, electric vehicles are rolling generators. You can see the 150 has been advertised as something that can actually power the house for 2 to 3 days. V2G will make an opportunity for building owners to flatten or reduce their demand peak for participating customers. And in emergency situations, we're going to be seeing portable units that will be deployed where the emergency is. So there's a lot of things that are coming up that I think that require these types of tools to be able to really look at the way we do business and how we value it. So without any further ado, I'm going to send the control over to Christine.
Thanks, Pete. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Standard Practice Manual for Distributed Energy Resources that Pete referenced earlier. Talk a little bit about how the manual is structured and what its key components are. And then in the second half of my presentation, talk about its application to electric vehicle programs using Maryland as an example. And that includes both programs that are designed to increase adoption of EVs, getting more EVs on the road, as well as those that are set up to manage EV loads. Next slide, please. One more. So back in 2017, so 4.5 years ago, the National Standard Practice Manual for assessing cost effectiveness of energy efficiency resources was released. More recently, last summer, in August of 2020, we released an updated manual that was intended to apply to all distributed energy resources. And it has a chapter in particular on electrification, both of buildings and vehicles. And that is the foundation that we're now working from. Next slide, please. In a nutshell, the kind of hundreds of pages manual boils down to really 3 things. The first is a fundamental set of economic principles that we believe should underpin any assessment of benefits and costs and cost effectiveness. Secondly, the manual lays out a multi-step process for any state to identify the impacts that matter, the categories of impacts that matter to it, and develop a primary cost effectiveness test from that work. And then thirdly, there's some guidance on when and how to use secondary cost effectiveness tests. Next slide. So I'm going to take a minute or two to talk a little bit about the first part of that, the core benefit cost analysis principles that the NSPM articulates. The first is that it is important to recognize that distributed energy resources can provide energy or power system needs, and should therefore be compared with other energy resources and with each other in a consistent framework. Another way of saying this is that we should have a single primary cost effectiveness test and testing framework that applies to all DERs and really indeed to all resources, period, whether it's supply or demand side. The second core principle of the NSPM is that the determination of what categories of impacts one includes in that primary cost effectiveness test for DERs should be based on the state's applicable policy goals. We'll talk more about that shortly. Thirdly, once you've decided what categories of impacts to include in your test, given your policy goals, it is important that you include both the costs and the benefits as comprehensively as you can for each of those categories. And as the fourth principle suggests here, that includes some way of accounting for even difficult to quantify impacts. Fifth, your analysis of benefits and costs and cost effectiveness needs to be forward-looking, focused on the incremental impacts, whether costs or benefits that DER investments will produce. Number 6 seems like mom and apple pie and self-evident, but it can get complicated. We need to make sure that we don't double count costs or benefits in the process. Number 7, the determination in the process we go through for determining what test should be used, as well as how that test is then ultimately applied, needs to be transparent. And then lastly, and this is also really important, I'll talk about a little bit more briefly. It is important to understand that benefit cost analysis and rate impact assessment, while both valuable and useful, are 2 different things because they answer different questions, and it's important that we recognize that and not try to conflate those 2 items. Next slide. Historically, jurisdictions for efficiency programs and demand response programs and a whole host of other DER programs have used a set of kind of static traditional tests that were initially developed in California 50 years ago almost. At one extreme, or one end of the spectrum, I should say, that included the utility cost test, which looked at cost effectiveness solely through the perspective of the utility system, what utility system costs and benefits are going up or down and by how much. And at the other end of the continuum is the societal perspective. If we include everything that's happening or that's impacted kind of globally, what does that tell us about cost effectiveness? The point that we try to make in the manual is that those kind of static perspectives may or may not align with the state's applicable policy goals. And it is when one looks at cost effectiveness, the lens through which one looks at that question should be with respect to the state's policy goals. We call that the regulatory perspective. Next slide. This slide was a little complicated, but it endeavors to make that point, that your test, your cost effectiveness test for your state should be jurisdiction specific based on your jurisdiction specific policy goals. Now, as the first three examples on here show, the two on the top and the third one on the bottom left, it is possible that when you look at your state's policies, you will determine that your appropriate cost effectiveness test aligns perfectly with one of those three traditional historical perspectives on cost effectiveness. But it is also possible, in fact, I would argue from our experience in places that have attempted to do this, that when you look at your policy goals, you're actually more likely to come up with a test that is different from any of those historical tests, because your state's policy goals may drive you to include some things and not others that each of those historic tests, because they're static, kind of restrict you to. Next slide. And one more. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about work that has taken place over the past year, and Amanda will talk more about the process that we went through in that work with respect to cost effectiveness assessment of EV programs in Maryland. Another number of key kind of technical policy questions came up that we addressed in the process that Amanda is going to describe. The first is, what should Maryland's primary cost effectiveness test be? The second is, should we be considering rate impacts, and if so, how? The third, there was a bunch of what we now are calling boundary issues. So once we've decided that a set of category of impact should be included, where do we draw the boundary in terms of the quantification of those impacts? So if your policies drive you to be concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, are we concerned about the global benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or just the benefits within the state of Maryland or whatever other state we're talking about? There are similar questions that could be asked about a range of other impacts, including things like, well, if we lower market clearing prices or increase market clearing prices, are we just concerned with the effects that those changes have on all of PJM, or are we concerned about them only within the state of Maryland? So the set of boundary questions. A fourth issue that arose was what discount rate is appropriate in Maryland. Another one was, how applicable should the test that we come up with for EVs be to other DERs? And then we spent some time looking at how to kind of map in some detail the benefits and costs for different types of programs onto this framework. Next slide. Ultimately, originally in Maryland, the utilities proposed that the test be a kind of amalgamation, a weighted average of three of the traditional tests: the societal cost test, the ratepayer impact test, and the participant cost test. There were a number of concerns raised about that approach, including the fact that they may not, that amalgamation may not reflect the state's policy objectives. Secondly, that it conflates rate impacts with cost effectiveness because of the inclusion of RIM. And there were some other concerns as well. Ultimately, a decision was made once we started looking at the state's policy goals to adopt a test that was somewhat akin to the societal test, and to include a separate assessment on non-participants, including on their rates. Next slide. And one more. I'll come back more to the rate impact assessment in questions if folks are interested. With respect to the boundary issues, a decision was made that for environmental benefits, the state's policies drive us to be concerned about global boundaries. That is, we're concerned and we should quantify and monetize the benefits of, for example, greenhouse gas emission reductions globally. But for direct economic impacts, such as impacts on energy prices and tax credits, the determination was made that to draw the boundary around the state of Maryland, so that we're only focusing on those economic impacts and economic benefits or costs to Maryland residents. Next slide. Discount rates, a really complicated topic. One of the reasons it's complicated is that because once one decides to include the cost of carbon emissions, the value of those carbon emissions can range quite dramatically from $60 a ton at a 3% real discount rate to $400 a ton at a 1% real discount rate. We can talk more about that later. Ultimately, in Maryland, a decision was made to adopt a 2.5% real discount rate on a tentative basis, and to potentially change that going forward based on work that's ongoing in an energy efficiency working group. Next slide. There was one area of disagreement, which Amanda can talk more about to what extent should the test we adopted in Maryland apply to other DERs. Among other things, Amanda has suggested that the Maryland Commission open a docket to explore consistent application of a benefit cost framework across all DERs. Last slide. And I won't go into any of this. This is complicated, but just wanted to make the point that once all that work was performed to determine what the test should be, there's a lot of follow-on work that then needs to be done to determine for different types of programs, what things become costs and what things become benefits. This is just one table pulled from the Maryland report that illustrates how that was done. And with that, I think it's passing it back to Pete.
Thanks, Chris. I think actually it's probably all complicated, but I really appreciate you being able to take this and boil it down into something that's understandable for all of us. So nice job. I'm going to pass the over to Amanda to talk more about what happened in Maryland.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you to SEIA for inviting me to speak today. I will touch briefly on Maryland's grid modernization proceeding, PC44, as it is affectionately known as, our EV pilot, and then the history and process behind developing a consensus EV benefit cost analysis framework. Next slide, please. So the commission began the PC44 proceeding back in 2016 to review transforming the Maryland electric distribution grid. And PC44 has four main guiding principles, including creating a grid modernization framework that is affordable, reliable, customer-centered, and environmentally sustainable. Based on comments from interested stakeholders and public hearings, the Commission decided to focus on several areas for review, including rate design, electric vehicles, energy storage, interconnection process, competitive markets, and customer choice, because Maryland is a deregulated state for supply, and distribution system planning. There are work groups set up for all of these areas, and so far each of them has produced either a pilot or rulemakings to update Maryland's regulations. Distribution system planning was intentionally delayed to allow the other work groups some time to work through their specific issues before culminating in a broader discussion of the system at large. But it's finally getting started, and work group meetings should begin in early 2022. Next slide, please. The Commission approved a modified EV pilot from the proposal received by the work group in January of 2019. And the pilot is a 5-year pilot that's scheduled to conclude in December of 2023. Among the program offerings under the pilot, there are residential rebates for smart chargers, EV only time of use rates, and an off-bill credit program. On the multifamily side, there are also rebates for smart chargers. There is a demand charge credit program for eligible non-residential chargers. And finally, the utilities that are participating in the pilot were approved to own, operate, and maintain chargers limited to properties leased, owned, or occupied by a unit of the state, county, or a municipal government for public use. There's semi-annual reporting and hearings, evaluations being conducted at the midpoint and the end of the pilot. And the important piece for the discussion here today is that cost recovery is done through distribution rates. And those costs are set aside in a regulatory asset and then are reviewed for prudency as part of a future rate case. 2 utilities so far have come in and been approved to recover their pilot costs, but there were issues raised with their BCAs that they submitted, and that's what ultimately led to the process we're going to talk about in a little bit. But this table on the slide illustrates the number of rebates and public chargers approved by utility. In total, over 5,000 chargers via rebates or utility-owned charging stations are approved to be installed as part of the pilot. Next slide, please. As I just mentioned on the previous slide, the Commission required EV pilot utilities to seek cost recovery through traditional rate making in future rate cases. As part of their cost recovery, the utilities are required to include a cost benefit analysis in support of their requests. Baltimore Gas and Electric Company, or BG&E, was the first utility to request cost recovery for its EV pilot and subsequently included an EV BCA in its rate case. Several parties during the proceeding, including the ratepayer advocate, the Office of People's Counsel, and the Commission's own technical staff, raised concerns with the EV BCA that was filed as part of the case. Those issues include the appropriateness of the costs and benefits included or excluded from the BCA, the appropriateness of the tests included in the BCA, and the reasonableness of some of the assumptions used. As part of the Commission's order on the rate case, the Commission acknowledged that the utility had provided a well-intentioned BCA for its EV pilot, but that the issues the other parties raised were valid concerns, that they wanted additional input from interested parties, and they thought it would be beneficial for the work group to discuss and develop a consensus BCA to be used by all of the pilot utilities. And for that, proposal will be filed by December 1st of 2021. As part of its directive, the Commission requested the work group to examine the National Standard Practice Manual, the existing Evaluation, Verification, and Measurement, or EM&V framework of the Empower Maryland Energy Efficiency Programs, and other sources as relevant. The EV work group formed an EV BCA work group for interested stakeholders to participate in the development of a consensus methodology. We met 11 times over the course of this year, and the final proposal was filed just a few weeks ago on the 1st, and will be reviewed by the Commission at one of its weekly administrative meetings early next year. Next slide, please. As Chris touched on earlier, when the work group was thinking about framing a BCA methodology, it was important to think through the important questions and issues that, in this case, the regulators are trying to answer. And so the work group looked at two larger questions of essentially what are we evaluating through these pilot programs, and then what are we trying to measure with our cost effectiveness testing. And the answers to these questions really got to the heart of the scope and purpose of the BCA for the utility EV programs. The work group determined that the regulator, in this case the Maryland Commission, needed to be informed of the appropriateness of ratepayers funding utility EV programs. And so for the Commission to have a complete picture, they needed to know what the cost effectiveness of the programs are and what the impacts to ratepayers are. And so accordingly, broader EV market questions are really outside of the scope of the final framework. Then the work group discussed some of the more discrete issues related to an EV BCA, including assumptions, transparency, and specific tests. We reviewed, there's a large body of policy and regulatory goals, and we looked at things like greenhouse gas reduction, electric vehicle, vehicle electrification, and other climate change policies as well. So next slide, please. So as previously discussed, the work group was required to review both the NSPM and the Empower framework. And we were really fortunate enough to have the experts behind the NSPM, the independent evaluator for the Empower programs, and the expert consultants for both the utilities and the ratepayer advocate assist the work group and provide meaningful comments and edits throughout the process. What I really want to emphasize here is how important these resources and the stakeholder process were in terms of providing a solid foundation for forming a consensus proposal for the Commission. The process is important because every state or jurisdiction has slightly different questions to answer, policies to address, and needs to be met. Utilizing good resources and discussing them with the relevant stakeholders and industry experts really allows for the nuances of the cost-benefit methodology to be adequately explored and appropriately addressed so that the final product meets the needs of the state or jurisdiction and is transparent for everyone to understand. The Maryland EV BCA work group went through 4 iterations of the white paper before landing on a final version that was filed with the commission. And because of the time and effort that was taken to look closely at every detail, I think the final product really benefited from that thoroughness of the stakeholder process. Next slide, please. And finally, the framework is the culmination of the work group's efforts and represents a consensus approach to a methodology for Maryland. It does address all the issues that were raised in the BGE rate case, and there are several important features to note. Chris went over a lot of these details earlier, but I just wanted to highlight that the framework does measure both the cost effectiveness and ratepayer impacts with separate tests. And you can see, obviously, there's the primary test and the supporting tests, and they each measure slightly different things. And then the second noteworthy feature is that the framework has been designed to account for all of the costs and benefits relevant to the utility EV programs, including those that impact the utility, participants in the pilot, and society. You can see the list on the slide, and there's a lot more details located in the actual white paper, including sources for the assumptions used in the tests. Next slide, please. And with that, I want to conclude by saying thank you to SEIA for having me today and for everyone's time. I really think that the work group was fortunate to have great stakeholder participation and discussions throughout the work group process, and that the final product really benefited from the expertise of the industry experts and all of the stakeholders in the work group. So I look forward to more discussion today.
Thank you, Amanda. That was great, and I'm going to look forward to digging into this a little bit more. But right now, we are going over to Evan Lawrence, who's going to tell us what's going on in North Carolina.
Hi, hello, and thank you for being here to listen. I'm giving a brief overview of the really Duke Energy, their electric transportation pilot that they had filed here in North Carolina 2.5 years ago now. So next slide, please. And I will apologize in advance. I have a little bit of a cold, so if I have some trouble talking at one point, it's because of that. So a brief overview of the North Carolina Public Staff to help give you some perspective. We were established in 1977. We represent the using and consuming public, which is a pretty important distinction here that I know some states do not have. And we are independent from the Utilities Commission, which is also different than some states. Next slide, please. And then to give you some perspective for the electric industry here in North Carolina, here's a map of the service areas. We're mostly served, actually, contrary to what the map shows, by Duke Energy, Progress, and Carolinas. They collectively have about 65% of the power sales within North Carolina. The commission does not regulate the EMCs of municipalities, except on a very few specific matters. Then Duke Energy, both Progress and Carolinas, operate within South Carolina, and then Dominion Energy in the upper northeast corner operates mostly in Virginia. Only about 5% of their service territory is here in North Carolina. Next slide, please. So in late March of 2019, Duke Energy filed a joint petition for approval of an electric transportation pilot program. This consisted of 7 programs between the 2 utilities. They were identical programs. They totaled $76 million for the 2 of them. And the offerings were split 60-40 between DEC and DEP in terms of cost. They had filed separate and smaller requests in South Carolina and Florida as well that were had several of the same programs as here in North Carolina. Next slide, please. So they had requests of the seven offerings within the pilot program. There was residential rebate and commercial and industrial fleet rebates for the installation of EV charging equipment. These offered rebates of $1,000 and $2,500 for the installation of that equipment. In exchange, during the first year, charging behaviors would be monitored, and then the next 2 years, they would be placed on a schedule that would allow the utility to manage their charging. Then there was an EV school bus program, which offered a rebate of $215,000 per bus purchased. The school was responsible for the charging equipment, and this was intended to test the capabilities of the bidirectional capabilities of the batteries. Next slide, please. Then there was a request for an EV transit bus program where Duke would install and own the charging equipment at the selected transit agencies' locations. Multifamily level 2 charging, which would allow Duke to install and own level 2 charging equipment at places like apartments and townhomes, any multifamily dwellings. Then a public level 2 charging infrastructure and DC fast charge networks. Those were pretty similar, where Duke would allow the charging equipment and charge a rate depending on where they were, and the DC fast charge infrastructure would be at strategic locations for the North Carolina's electric vehicle corridors across the interstates. Next slide, please. So the public staff, we largely opposed this pilot for a few reasons. After really questioning Duke on this, how things were going to happen and what they were actually going to get out of it, it seemed like things weren't really, maybe not have been completely thought through. There were very ideas that seemed like they were in very early stages of development, not really ready for filing. It really seemed like a request for pre-approval of money for infrastructure projects, which should have been business as usual in some cases. The application discussed studying impacts to the grid, but there didn't really seem to be any solid mechanisms in place to do so. We were critical of the application, but that was completely due to the role of the utility and the usefulness of the information, or lack thereof, that would come of it. We have no problem with them incentivizing electric vehicle adoption in ways that are beneficial to the customers. We fully recognize that EVs can be beneficial to the system and to other customers, but this pilot didn't really seem to hurt. We believed it would hurt more than it would help in those manners. Next slide, please. So the commission approved programs for each utility that were about half of the money that they had requested. They approved scaled back versions of the public level 2 charging, the DC fast charging, and the multifamily charging. They didn't approve the rebates or transit bus programs. The biggest thing to come out of that order, they included criteria that they wanted to see for future pilot program filings. Next slide, please. So these pilot program requirements that they wanted to see, they said proper scale and scope had to be identified. They want to see experimental rate designs. Rate design's been a big topic in front of our commission. Duke Energy has a new billing and customer billing and information system and AMI metering here, and they want to make sure that that's utilized. So that was a big reason why it was installed. They specifically said they wanted to see a cost benefit analysis. They want to know how the companies have leveraged funding from other opportunities, whether it's federal, state incentives. They want to know if a make-ready approach is a viable option. Then they want specific objectives, metrics, and verifications that to be able to see what you're measuring before the program, and not trying to figure that out while you're trying to implement the program. And finally, they want reporting requirements spelled out beforehand and a stakeholder process to help develop the whole program. To me, this seems like a direct response to the fact that this pilot was more of in the early planning stages instead of in a filing phase when it was filed. The commission wants fully developed and thought out filings where parties have worked together beforehand to try to work things out instead of arguing through filing comments and whatnot. Next slide, please. So the second phase of the pilots, they included more of the same thing, really. There was not, they asked for expanded versions on things that had been already scaled back from their original versions. They didn't include much of anything of what the commission said needed to be in a pilot program. So on a lot of the same reasons, we had opposed that second filing as well. Through that, though, they did file make-ready credits, and which we had agreed with. Next slide, please. And so through this, I believe that commission's ordering this, they sent out a message saying, things need to be thought out. It needs to be a solid program when it's filed. The cost benefit analysis especially is very, very important for utilities to be able to show what's going on, what are customers getting, and how are they getting it. And it shows that the program is thought out, and it's going to be beneficial to everybody. And especially on a program such as this, in a lot of states, it's unclear how the role of utilities in EV adoption and that landscape. And so if you bring a cost benefit analysis forward that shows that it's going to be beneficial to customers, it's going to make it a lot more appealing and a lot easier for a regulator to approve when all things considered. So thank you for your time. I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Evan. That was great, and I'm very interested to see the back and forward there. So I'm going to actually ask you the first question, if you don't mind. You asked for data to be shown and scaling it back and getting it the right size. Are you now seeing any of that? Are you seeing the fruits of that come out of the Duke pilot?
So they, for a number of reasons, the pilots are just now getting underway. The approval, I know it was filed in March 2019, but the approval by the commission was not until late 2020. And so I believe there are a few things coming up here where we're gonna see where they're at. We're having still some stakeholder discussions for that second round of filings that they had. And they are here soon. They should be getting some things underway where we can actually see some actions taken. But I think to the end of the time period where the next stakeholder process meeting should be coming up. It should have been in the next week or two, but because of holidays, it's going to be pushed back probably a month from now.
So we'll check back in with you a little bit later, and
Yeah.
That's great. And I just want to let everyone who's listening in, if you have questions, go ahead and type those in the Q&A, and we'll get there as quickly as we can. Chris, I've got a question for you. You stated that the jurisdiction should use the same primary cost effectiveness to test assess EVs and all DERs at the same time, but there's a lot of differences between those two. So how do you make sure that those differences get appropriately addressed?
Thanks, great question. I think let me start by saying this. The key is that the framework for assessing EVs and other DERs be the same. And what that means is the categories of impacts at a kind of high level that you include in your cost effectiveness be the same. So for example, if your policies drive you to be concerned about climate change and therefore want to value emissions of greenhouse gases, you should be valuing emissions of greenhouse gases whether you're looking at EVs or efficiency or anything else. If your policies say drive you to be concerned about impacts on participants, the participants in a program, you should be concerned about impacts on participants, whether it's EVs or efficiency or anything else. Now, those impacts on participants will be different for EVs than they will be for an efficiency program. For EVs, for example, in Maryland, there was a determination that the key participant impact beyond the energy savings that they receive is reduced maintenance costs. For energy efficiency programs, depending on the program, maintenance costs may not be relevant at all. It might be improved comfort or some other impact. But if we look at it as we're including participant impacts, we can account for the fact that those participant impacts are different between the two different types of DER resources. And the same would be true on the utility grid. The impacts of a demand response program will be different than the impacts of an electrification program. So it's really about getting the framework the same in a way that accommodates the fact that at a more detailed level, the impacts will be different from different DERs, and the way you actually apply the framework needs to reflect that.
Great. Amanda, over to you. So why is it, what is important for regulators to know about the process of forming a BSA methodology for the jurisdiction? I mean, is there how do you boil it down into a process that all can follow?
Sure, thanks, Pete. It was interesting when I saw the directive for the work group. I thought, how are we going to do this in 11 months? This is a lot of work. But it really is important to have a good set of resources, which we were fortunate to have, and really engage stakeholders. And I think it's important for work group leaders and commissions to ensure that you do have a broad range of stakeholders. You have your industry experts, you have your utilities, you have your state agencies, but also make sure that you have folks from the actual EV industry, that you have other advocates, and we had some members of the public that were really engaged in the process as well. So I think having a well-formed stakeholder group and then building on the foundation of really good resources makes the process much less painful. So we were able to actually do this in a year, which still amazes me. But I think that the final product really benefits from that process. So it's just really important to set out good guidelines for the stakeholder process, and I think everything will flow from there.
Cool. I'd like to throw one out for the entire panel because it's an interesting one from my perspective. How do you value societal impacts? I mean, and that really gets wonky for me, because if I'm going to reduce the instances of asthma, that you would think that medical costs would go down, but I'm a utility. So how do I value that in my pro forma and actually make that show up and show a benefit case? Anybody care to take a whack at that one?
I'll take a shot at it. I think there's a couple aspects to the answer to that question, Pete. The first is that what matters when you're deciding from a state regulatory perspective what is included in your test, your cost effectiveness test, how you're going to perform benefit cost analysis, can be more than what the kind of bottom line impacts are on the electric grid. And it's your state's policies that should drive you to determine whether that's the case. And then to include in your assessment of whether something is cost effective, if your energy policies drive you to do so, impacts on emissions of greenhouse gases or criteria pollutants or other so-called societal impacts. The utility companies should not be kind of whatever their kind of more narrow focus is, should not be driving that. It should be policies, because that's ultimately that's what the regulators as government entities are designed to or should be set up to try to address. Now, that's simply for answering the question, is this investment or this program cost effective or not, given our state's policy goals? There are different questions that can come up, like, okay, it's cost effective. Well, how much money should we be prepared to spend on it? And those different questions might require different kinds of tests or different ways to answer them than whether it's cost effective or not. But whether it's cost effective or not is the starting point. You could look through different lenses at questions like, well, how much should we be prepared to spend on it? And that's perfectly reasonable.
Very cool. Anybody else like to add on? Okay, I've got a question from the audience, from Lisa. With the expectation that medium heavy duty fleets will scale up quickly, and I think they will, how does the current regulatory environment in North Carolina allow utilities to pre-wire for fleet infrastructure prior to demonstrating that they need it for load? That's a big deal for us. The cart or the horse, right? Can put a significant time lag on fleet conversions. And just to add some color commentary to that, if our current mass transit here converted to 150 buses, I'd have to build a substation, which is 5 years out. So how do you do that? Who'd like to take a crack at that?
So I believe since North Carolina was mentioned in that, I can give some answer. I'm not sure how good of an answer it'll be, because it is hard for a utility to look out 5 years and project load that may or may not be there and attribute revenue directly to that. We do have the Make Ready credit that was requested approval for, but that is the credit based on the expected revenue that would be achieved from the customer for installing that equipment and that extra load. So it's you got to figure out who needs to bear the risk and how much risk is it actually going to be. If for a city that was installing buses, electric buses, that might be a little bit easier of a risk to bear. If it's a industrial customer that might come in 5 years, that may be a little different. that might be a little bit harder to justify. So there is a balance between the time that is there, the expected revenue, and the risk that you spend the money and they won't join or it won't come, that are all balanced. Excuse me.
Anybody else? Okay. So how do you value, just another question for you, how do you value off-peak charging to the valleys in utility duct curve? So how do we make sure that you regulate businesses into those valleys, keep them in there, and then what do you do when they overflow?
Well, I'll take a shot. So I think there's a couple of lenses through which one can answer that question. The first is the question of cost effectiveness. So from a cost effectiveness perspective, on the electric grid, anytime you are adding load with an EV, you're adding cost. It's just a question of how much cost. If you're adding it in the valleys when electricity is cheap, the amount of cost you're adding is small. If you're adding at the times of peak when electricity is expensive and you have capacity resources to worry about, then the cost is high. If we were to only look at electric utility system costs, EV programs would always fail because they're always adding cost. So from a cost effectiveness perspective, EVs only make sense if you're looking from a multi-fuel perspective, because you've got all of the gasoline savings, for example, that are offsetting the increase in costs to the electric system. And again, whether it's the valley or the peak is what determines how much that, what the magnitude of that cost is. That's the cost effectiveness perspective. And as you move to filling those valleys to the point where you're now creating new peaks, over time, those costs are going to get higher when you get to that point. The other lens through which one can answer that question is with respect to rate impacts. And again, rate impacts are a separate question from cost effectiveness. And to the extent that you're filling valleys, mostly with EV programs, you're going to be lowering rates because the added costs are more than offset by the added revenue from kind of fixed rates. Once you start adding to the peaks, that answer might change. And you just have to make sure that your analyses are sophisticated enough that they're prepared to capture those differences, both on the cost effectiveness assessment and on the rate impact assessment.
So I know we only have a few more minutes here. I want to give each of you an opportunity if you want to leave anything that you want to make sure people take home with them. Evan, you want to start? You're on mute.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I've really enjoyed this webinar. I've seen a lot of stuff that I'll take back, and I think, as I kind of said on my last slide, fully developed cost benefit analysis shows a lot to a regulator. It gives a lot of comfort knowing that the program's thought out, that small points have been considered, and really it kind of helps open the door to see what's behind everything. And it's not just a sheet of paper with some words and numbers on it that makes you want to feel good. It actually shows you that you should feel good. So
very good. Thanks, Evan. Amanda.
Yeah, I think that all the commissions and regulators across the country are going to be facing similar questions, right? And having a reliable and even playing field for all the stakeholders involved in the proceedings is very important, because that allows for the discussion to move beyond just what should be in the BCA or what's in it, or kind of just the framework of the BCA. And if everyone knows what's on the what's included in it up front, then it can get to even more substantive questions. And so I think not only for EVs is it important to have BCA, but really a broader look at what cost effectiveness and types of analyses are being done at commissions and how those should be tailored for the future as the grid continues to modernize and as more variety of proceedings become before the commission, so that everyone's prepared to really delve into those issues.
Thank you, Amanda. Chris, any last words?
Yeah, I'll just want to echo a little bit of what Amanda said about the importance of the process. I think the Maryland Commission did a really good thing by asking stakeholders and utilities to kind of work together to try to flesh out the issues, to develop a kind of consensus approach to cost effectiveness assessment in the state. I think Amanda did a great job with her colleagues of kind of managing that process. It's really absolutely necessary, I think, kind of thing is for states to get to a point where they're actually sure that when they're looking at whether something is cost effective, they're looking at it through the lens that's consistent with what their goals and objectives are.
Fantastic. And I know we're out of time. I know there was some questions from Frank. Frank, if you want to reach out to me afterwards, I'd love to have that longer conversation with you. So I want to thank all of the participants, the panelists. You guys have put in a lot of great information, which I'm pretty sure that everyone's going to be able to use. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate your effort in doing this, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from the projects that you are working on in Maryland and in North Carolina. So thank you very much. Sarah, any last words?
Yeah, thank you so much, Pete, for moderating today. It was great. And thank you to all of our speakers. You guys did a fantastic job. And yes, leaving today with a lot more information about planning EV programs than I did when I started. As we mentioned at the top, a recording of today's presentation and the slide deck will be emailed to everybody who registered. We also would love your feedback to let us know how we did about in today's webinar. So that was in the chat, and hopefully you guys got it. It will also be in the email that you receive. And other than that, have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see everybody again in 2022.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you all. All right, have a great day.